this really has been a journey for me. So it started in a writing workshop in Northampton, Massachusetts, when I was working at the Springfield Union News, and I was writing, four stories and two briefs on a Friday, exhausted from covering the council meeting the night before in this little bureau. And I would type like an inch a minute because I was on deadline and I had to leave the council meeting before the vote even happened. So I had to anyway, that was my life. And I was like, well, I've been writing short stories because I didn't start until 3 o'clock for quite a while when I worked at that paper, and I would have this whole day and I would sit there and write short stories. So once I finally got hired full time and I was covering, these council meetings and what have you, I would take these writing workshops on a Sunday, and it was like a 3 hour block of time. I never thought I'd have the energy for it, but I loved it. They give you these trigger exercises, and I just started like accessing parts of my brain that I didn't even know were there because I could never write really good fiction before that. I mean, I was a nonfiction writer. That's what you do as a journalist. You write what you see, you write what people say, you write the truth, you write what you can investigate, but you're not allowed to make anything up, and you can't get anything wrong, and you're not even supposed to, extrapolate, it has to be the truth. It has to be a quote that somebody said. So this opened up my brain, and I started doing what we call these little germs. And those little germs became diary entries for this character I was creating. And I started writing like a novella. And I was talking to my mom about it. She said, you should really turn this into a novel. So I started trying to write a novel because at the time I was reading a lot of Patricia Cornwell, a lot of Michael Connelly. And I thought, I want to write a crime book. I think that's what I want to do. And so Ken Goode, I was also homesick. Here I am in freezing cold Northampton, Massachusetts, where, it snows, and I had to go out trying to be a reporter, and, I've got to get the ice and the snow off my car before I go anywhere. It's like, I grew up here in San Diego where it's sunny, Anyway, so I was watching MTV, and I was like, I kind of missed the surfers, where I grew up in La Jolla, and it was kind of like a nostalgic thing. So I started creating this character because I was kind of homesick for California. So that became Naked Addiction. It took me 17 years to get it published. I went to all these writing conferences. I submitted it to editors on my own. I finally, get an agent, but I couldn't get it published for many years because I didn't really know what I was doing. Because I didn't have all the background that I have now. I didn't write true crime books and know how a homicide investigation in what that entails, and how do homicide detectives think, and how do they talk, and what do they do, and in what order. I didn't know any of that. So yeah, Naked Addiction, I wrote it. It took 17 years to get published. It came out in 2007. So it was a huge journey just to get that book published, but I didn't know how to do marketing either. And so it basically just didn't sell. And so I was really sad because my dream was to be a crime fiction writer. And because that didn't work, my first book was Poison Love that I described earlier. That did really well, and so that kind of carried me. So the bookstore stocked Naked Addiction, thinking it was going to sell well because my first book sold so well, and it didn't because it's a totally different genre and a different part of the bookstore. Anyway, but I didn't give up. I'm like, well, I'm going to write a series. So I wrote a second book, and the same publisher that published Naked Addiction didn't want to publish the sequel. So Hooked, believe it or not, was originally envisioned as the sequel to Naked Addiction, but as it turned out, it took another 17 years. I went through several agents. I completely rewrote it from start to finish, clean file, literally starting over. I rewrote the first chapter, made a new first chapter. I mean, I did everything you possibly could do. And yes, Katrina Chopin was not envisioned originally as part of the series, but in order to make it a new series, it has to have a different dynamic and a different set of characters. So basically, Ken Goode has evolved and grown as have I, because it's been 34 years since I started writing Naked Addiction. And I don't want to say how old I am, but my character, Ken Goode, is 37, and I'm no longer in my 30s or 40s, but I'm still writing that same character because I love him. So Ken Goode is a surfing homicide detective who's home away from home, second home, is Sea, which is a beach in La Jolla. It's a pretty famous surfing spot that I used to go to. And it was kind of, he has this part of me, which is, before I went off to college, Sea was for me what it is for him. And it's kind of like you're a homing pigeon and you've got to go back to Sea and put your foot in the water before you can leave and say goodbye and go into the world. So that's kind of, I gave that to him because that's part of me. But he loves the ocean. And, when he has to think, when he's got to, process information or what's going on with him personally or professionally, he goes to Sea and he sits and he watches the waves. So Ken Goode is from La Jolla, and he's also like me in some ways. I grew up in La Jolla. I went to La Jolla High. I went to Muirlands, and I was felt like I was on the outside. My parents did not have a lot of money. They were, worked in a university. Ken Goode's parents are teachers at La Jolla High, and he's, on the outside looking at all these wealthy kids from these wealthy families who's would go to La Jolla Beach and Tennis Club on Friday nights for this dinner dance that you were never invited to. And, it's a very much almost like a caste system. So I'm bringing all of my personal experience that I went through and I'm giving it to him. But he's a man and I'm not a man. And one thing that I learned when I was writing a male character is, I'm not a man. So I definitely had beta readers and interviewed people. And I, I have detectives actually who read my books before I publish them to make sure that I get the protocol right and I make sure that I don't have them saying something stupid that they would never say or think. And then Katrina Chopin is also part of me, but she's not me. So yes, she's an investigative reporter, but I've got to, you got to be careful because these characters are not you, because then they're not big enough to be fictional characters, right? If they're too much you, as a reporter, you can't do a lot of things that you need a character to do in fiction because the stakes aren't high enough. So I tried to use actually some of those restrictions, which are ethics. And I heard Michael Connolly say this actually at, I think it was BoucherCon, that the reason that he didn't really use reporters in his stories is for this very reason. And so I kind of said, you know what? I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm going to actually take that limitation and that restriction, and I'm going to make it part of the conflict of the story. So my characters are ethical and they have integrity. And Hooked is set in 2015 when we still had newsrooms, like we used to have newsrooms, and the energy of that, when there were still a bunch of people in the room and they were like all doing interviews and you could hear each other talk and you could see the editors in their glass offices, talking to each other and yelling at each other or throwing a chair at each other or whatever it was that you could see going on. And there was just so much drama and it was like a fishbowl. And so I'm writing this story. A lot of the story takes place in the newsroom. So, it takes place at the beach, it takes place in the newsroom, but it's a time that has passed. And so this is almost historical fiction and an homage to old school journalism and ethics and integrity and the rule of law and all the stuff that you and I were talking about before we started, recording for this show today, the stuff that seems to be missing and has just gone horribly, horribly wrong. This book, these characters still believe in that stuff and people still look to them for answers and trust them and the journalist. And that I think is really important and a selling point because I think people miss that or should. If they don't realize it, when they read it, they'll see. She comes to San Diego where she's from. She went to Northampton, which is also where I lived. So I gave her, different places that I had also worked because I know them, and while she was there, she was investigating this story that involved the Polish mafia that owned a waste company, which is there are some waste companies in that area where I used to work, which are run by these Polish families. Anyway, so I basically had her covering this corrupt Polish mafia type family getting a trash contract with the school district. Anyway, the superintendent is involved in the corruption and all this. And the wife is going through some estrangement from this guy and starts passing documents to Katrina about information. Next thing you know, she ends up dead. Her eyes are gouged out. like basically the message is, she talked from what, and because of what she saw, and so it's a message to Katrina to try to intimidate her. She has a stalker in Northampton as well. There's like a car that's sitting outside her. I mean, I kind of mentioned this, and I might probably mention it later in the series, but this was all in my head about this backstory that she had. That so there was a stalker that she had in Northampton. She's not even sure where this stalker is from. Is it that stalker? Or because that trial hasn't happened yet, they're trying to pressure her to testify. Or is it because of what she's investigating now, which is, these two suspicious deaths that take place in this really wealthy pocket of La Jolla that Ken Goode and she are both investigating independently. That involves, very rich people with a lot of money who are very much financially invested in this biotech company that is developing, now this is the fun part, a sexual enhancement drug that I made up. And so all of these rich men are waiting for this drug to hit the market because they think it's going to make them so much money. And they're also really excited to use the drug themselves. In Hooked, there are some things that are left, open questions, which makes way for the sequel, because the sequel staged picks up right where Hooked leaves off. So she tells Goode, that the reason she came back to San Diego, or part of the reason she came back to take this job at the San Diego Sun-Dispatch, which is an imaginary newspaper, but happens to have a newsroom that is exactly like the one I worked at the San Diego Union-Tribune. She basically says, the reason I came back is the same reason I left. 5 years ago, my parents were murdered. They were federal judges. They were gunned down in the driveway in Point Loma where they lived. And the police basically said, you probably should get out of town and lay low for a while. So that's what she did. She went to Northampton, worked at this tiny little paper. But then she came back and she's like, nothing's happened. They haven't solved the case. I want to pressure the police to reopen this cold case into my parents because my brother, my fraternal twin brother, Franny, they say he killed himself, with an overdose. And I don't think that's true. I think he was murdered. So it could be 3 murders that I'm looking at, and they could all be related. So that's kind of how Staged starts. Is the murder of her parents. So yeah, that kind of raises those ideas in Hooked, and then in Staged you learn all about how that happened.